Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I have the honor of welcoming an old friend, Dr. Channah Damatov, onto the podcast. Dr. Channah recently received her PhD, and she is an expert at the Book of Esther, which happens to coincide with both where we are at in a Jewish calendar, and as we'll discuss, a lot of the themes that are very relevant to what's going on now in 2024 in the Jewish world. Channah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi Daniel.
Of course, I'm so excited. And just to frame this for listeners, my last podcast was a little bit about the holiday of Purim in general. So for listeners that are not familiar with the holiday of Purim coming up in a couple of days, go back and listen to that. But in general, the Book of Esther has always been a fascinating book. And it's really unique how it lays out in the Tanakh. Just for some listener background, God is not mentioned at all in the Book of Esther, which is always, perks people's interest and starts controversy. It is one of the only books in the Tanakh that has a female main character, the other one being the book of Ruth. This book, the setting is outside of the land of Israel, which is somewhat unique for the book of Tanakh. So a lot of iconoclastic details in this book. So just first question, what drew you to the book of Esther and how did you start becoming an expert?
So I am actually Persian as well as Jewish. And my parents, they grew up visiting the tomb of Esther and Mordechai in Hamadan in Iran from a young age, sort of as a rite of passage. It's probably the only Jewish holy site in Iran. So it's had significance for Iranian Jews for eternity, right? Whether or not they're really buried there is a question, but regardless, it is important to Persian Jews. And so I always imagined as a child growing up in LA, I've never stepped foot in Iran myself, but hearing that and knowing on some level that the Book of Esther feels almost like a story of our ancestors as Iranian Jews, as opposed to just another book of Tanakh that speaks to our global Jewish heritage, it had profound impact on me, and it pulled me in a way that I can only imagine carried me to where I am now. And what I've been fascinated by in my research since becoming a scholar, especially on the reception of Esther, particularly in Victorian literature, but also branching out a little bit from there, is how its themes are so timeless. And like you say, how it's such an exceptional text with regards not only to the lack of the name of God, and also to it being named for a heroine, but also for the themes that it tackles that in a somewhat ironic or parodic, even carnivalesque way. And every time I read the text or approach it, something new comes out of it for me. And so there's both that personal side and there's the research angle that I take towards it. And I hope we can delve into that a bit today.
Yeah, of course. And just to continue on something you were saying, one of the fascinating aspects for me, and just even talking about the ancient reception history, eventually we'll get to your research in modern reception history after talking about the wider themes, because there's a lack of God being mentioned in the book, and I've said this in previous podcasts, it opens the book up to a wealth of interpretation. Because if you're somebody who believes that no, of course God was there below the surface, that's your interpretation. If you're somebody that's approaching it from a more secular perspective, right, you can give it a much more secular political interpretation. This, of course, in the ancient world was a big debate. There's a discussion in the Talmud about whether or not Esther should be included in the Tanakh. Famously or infamously, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ascetic group of Jews who left Jerusalem in the first century supposedly never brought the Book of Esther with them, and the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, had its own interpretive version translation where God is basically added in. So fascinating book, full of controversy. Let's go to some themes. So what would you say are the major themes of the Book of Esther?
Well, I think, first of all, exile, like you mentioned, this is an exilic people. And depending how you date Esther, most scholars will date Esther between the late 4th to early 3rd century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire. But where exactly you date it suggests whether or not you believe that the Jews living in the Persian kingdom at the time that it's written, or for the audience that it's written for, were there by choice or were there by force, right? Were they there after Cyrus the Great in the Cyrus Cylinder famously allowed the Jews to return to the land of Israel and to rebuild the Second Temple, or were they there before that? And how you approach the text itself with that in mind has a lot to say, has a lot to bear on how a reader will approach the exilic community there. If they're there by choice, which we know there are Talmudic Midrashic sources that suggest that Achashverosh was actually even using the vessels of the first temple. And, then it paints a very different, if not somewhat negative picture of the Jews living there. What were they still doing there in exile? And the question of it not being included in the Dead Sea Scrolls also speaks a little bit to the tension of where the seat of interpretive power was at the time. Was it in the recently conquered Bavel, right? The Persians having conquered the Babylonian Empire, or was it in Jerusalem? And so there's a lot to unpack there. And I think exile is a major theme also in terms of the story itself, right? You have Esther, who passes as non-Jewish in the Persian court as per Mordecai's instruction. You have Mordecai, who, until he brings it to the attention of Haman in the story, is not actually known to be a Jew. So he's passing, and Haman only knows that his not bowing down is disrespectful by dint of his being Jewish, because someone tells him. Someone tells Haman, Mordecai, he was told that he's a Jew. It's not that he knew. So there's this sense of passing, and there's a sense of how a community in exile can go ahead and make it in exile. How can they survive? How can they get by? So, like Yoram Hazony famously in his book on Esther describes how there was a strategy, a political strategy to getting ahead there and to becoming a people that is not oppressed, but rather has a seat of power and maintains that seat of power. And these are questions that I think are timeless. Beyond that, obviously, you have proto-feminist or feminist themes running through the Megillah, whether, in Vashti as a character, which in the last 150 years, we've actually seen quite a change in the reception of Vashti as a feminist icon. And with Esther herself, right? Where here we are with the heroine who is on some level doubly oppressed. If we look at the Book of Esther itself as a tale where Achashverosh calls Vashti out, right, before the drunken masses at his party and refuses to appear before him. And because of her refusal to appear, an entire population is then oppressed because Achashverosh's advisors say, well, this is not just a rebellion against you. She could inspire all the women of the kingdom to rebel against their husbands, and we need to quash this imagined, feminist revolution from happening. She's one rebel who is then considered representative of an entire population, women. The same thing happens just a few chapters later with Mordecai. Mordecai is a singular Jew who refuses to bow down to Haman. And in that rebelling, he is identified as Jewish, and an entire population is written off. The Jewish people are written off for total genocide because of it. And then who is the least likely person out of these two edicts, which create a cultural milieu in the Persian kingdom, which defines being a woman or being Jewish as being right, of a lower category? Esther. Esther's a Jewish woman, right? She's got like one stone here and one stone here weighing her down in terms of having very little power. And on top of it, she's an orphan. So there's a sense in which I think that theme, that proto-feminist or feminist theme, as well as the undoing of oppression by a minority, are both just hugely important in the text. And then how someone who represents really the intersection of both of these populations goes ahead and turns everything around. It's what makes the story so appealing to so many. And there are more. There are obviously so many more themes. The ironic poking fun at the regime that the text implicitly sort of subtextually goes ahead and executes through how it portrays their hyperbolic responses to things. and the carnivalesque spirit of Esther, which the Jewish people take very literally and seriously, and Vinhafochu, and we all dress up and become, in some ways, filled with that spirit of the carnivalesque that's inherent in Esther, and we have to drink until we don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai in the tradition. So there's a lot to really unpack there.
Yeah, I love that. So we mentioned just top themes, just to highlight it. We have exile, we have feminism / proto-feminism, and anti-Semitism / proto-anti-Semitism. Let's drill down on the feminist one, because I think that's really interesting. You had mentioned Vashti and the reception history of Vashti. Just to spell it out a little bit more explicit for listeners that aren't familiar, if you've never heard of Vashti before, you can pause the podcast and go read the very beginning of the Book of Esther. Vashti only has a couple of verses there that talk about her. But Vashti is seen in ancient literature as neutral / evil, right? And that's sort of how the rabbis point to her, right? She's descendant from, evil kings. And so the rabbis end up basically dragging Vashti through the mud, right? And they say that, well, the only reason why she didn't want to appear in front of the drunken masses wasn't because she didn't want to parade, naked, but because she developed, a skin condition and grew a tail in one rabbinic tradition. And so the rabbis have a lot of, quote unquote, fun with Vashti as sort of villainizing her. But that, of course, switches as we get into the last 150, 200 years. So how has Vashti reemerged, and what was that sort of reception history there? Was it, can we drill down to, one place and one time, one writer, or was it just sort of as early feminism was taking off, people looked at the story and said, guys, it doesn't actually seem like what she's doing is so bad.
Right. So listen, far be it for me to claim that I have such a wide breadth of knowledge on the reception of Vashti as to answer such a question. I mean, a lot of time elapsed between one and the other, but I can say I do think there was a point at which there was a popularization, at least in the West, of a different notion of Vashti than the one that heretofore had been accepted, whether by the rabbis or even by the Christian commentators, by the way, who were no big fans of Esther as a book or as a figure. So I think the point at which things start to turn is in the 19th century and with the Victorians. So we have women writers who are beginning to write these sacred heroine stories and really commentaries on women of the Bible. They didn't have a voice until now, really until the mid 1800s. And they're beginning to reclaim women in the Bible. And so for them, Vashti becomes this pioneer, this paragon of female agency. And so you have writers like Clara Lucas Balfour and famously Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the Women's Bible, which was a groundbreaking work of exegesis by women and on women, right? And they're writing things like Vashti was the first stand for women's rights. She was the first woman who dared to stand up to Ahasuerus, the king of all people. And they take from her a lot of inspiration, and they begin to write her as a proto-feminist or feminist character. And from there, I think it sort of takes off. So with the Victorians, you have, for example, Charlotte Bronte's Villette, where there's an entire chapter called Vashti, and where the actress in that chapter is named Vashti. And she goes ahead on stage and she gives this sort of mutinous performance against well, I mean, it's not even really clear exactly what, but what I take it to mean is a resurrection of Vashti of the Tanakh, of the biblical story of Esther and what she went through. And she's sort of resurrected from her exile there, and she's protesting against it. It's like a mutiny of what she had to experience as a woman rejected simply by having a degree of dignity, of refusing to appear, refusing to come out between the drunken masses of men and become a sex object, essentially. And so with that, Vashti of Villette, then you have, I think, sort of the floodgates open into interpretations of Vashti that are so very interesting. And Frances Harper on the other side of the coast in America, she's sort of an abolitionist feminist poet. She writes a poem called Vashti, wherein she also looks to Vashti as a character of inspiration for the freedom, not just of women, but also of slaves, of African-American slaves. So it's like doors wide open. And I think we've seen different eras and times where Vashti as a feminist figure has become exceptionally popular. And yeah, I think it just developed from there.
Yeah. So even just capturing something that you mentioned before, it's always been one of my favorite lines in the story of Esther because it's so ironic. We talked about this last week when we were preparing this conversation, that after Vashti disobeys, King Ahasuerus either, kicks her out or has her killed. Again, unclear exactly what happens there. And then Ahasuerus is sitting there and he's worried because he thinks that now, men are going to, start losing, power to their wives because, if the queen disobeys, what's stopping, random, countrywomen from disobeying? And so he sends this, paradoxical letter out, basically demanding that men be the masters in their own home, which is quite funny because you're basically being commanded by somebody to be in charge of your own home, which is always ironic, right? So you can just picture all these men getting these letters and say, I guess the king is making me, right? As if, you need the king to give you power. So there's a lot of paradox there. Even just thinking of women in general in the Megillat Esther, I never really viewed it towards, totally a feminist lens, but it seems like all the female characters, we have Vashti, we have Esther, of course, we have Haman's wife, Zeresh, who also seems to be driving a lot of the conversation. I mean, she really seems to be a lot of the mastermind and wisdom behind Haman, who at many times, and, for listeners that, have recently read the story, Haman at a lot of times seems confused or upset, and he shows up at home and it's sort of his wife that is laying out, no, you have to build the gallows, or no, actually it turns out that if Mordecai is part of the Jewish community, you might be in trouble there. So I don't know if Zeresh ends up also getting a lot of, interesting discussion, but it seems like the entire book, I mean, correct me if you disagree, the whole thing is pointing, it's almost satirizing, anti-feminism more than it is propping up feminism. It's just showing kind of how dumb the whole thing is, and most of the men in the story just end up being sort of fools or tricked. I'm curious if that coincides with, some of the ways in which you're reading this.
It's a very interesting point that you make about the women all being strong women, and the text itself potentially, at least in your reading, being more of an anti-feminist text, right? And I think you can't really draw a broad brushstroke over the men in the story, I don't think, but the women, I think you're making a compelling case there. Zeresh is definitely a more minor figure, receptively, but she's not invisible. There are definitely writers who pick up on the fact that she's pulling a lot of strings there and has wisdom that Haman seems to completely not have. And it's a question, where does this wisdom or this intuition come from about the rise and fall, right, of the balance of powers between the Persians and the Jews? But yeah, I think there's absolutely a place in which we can look at not just how the Megillah itself is potentially satirizing Ahasuerus and Haman, but also if we take it at face value that there was a certain culture, a toxic culture of the Persian Empire that did objectify women, that did, that it was not a beauty pageant, it was a sex contest, essentially, to find Ahasuerus a new queen. And Esther didn't, it depends how you read it. Did she or did she not have a choice in the matter? Did Mordecai put her up to it, or was she known to be a beauty? She was the adopted cousin of someone who was already politically involved in Shushan, in the capital, and in the government. So there are all these interesting and fascinating questions which people sort of take where they want. If there's one thing that I'm noticing in reception is that it's everybody reads Esther almost in light of themselves, right? Wherever your point of view or, whatever identification place you're in, you bring it to the text. There's a lot of writing on to the text. But what's interesting, at least to me, is that a lot of people pick up on the fact that Vashti seems to be written out of the text from the beginning, right? And in the text, she's not killed. It's not explicit that she's killed, but she's definitely dethroned, exiled, banished, something like that. But Timothy Beale, actually, in his book, the Book of Hiding, which is about Esther and annihilation in the Jewish people and feminism. He brings this up where there's a certain like palimpsest type situation going on where the text is Vashti is written, she's erased, and then Esther's story is sort of written right over hers. But there are echoes of the Vashti story that come through, right? It's not fully written. It's not a full erasure, right? It's a palimpsest in the sense that what Vashti was trying to do, just having dignity and asserting herself, rebelling fully against the Persian kingdom, didn't go so well for her. So Esther has to take a different approach. And her strategy is to have that insight into how she can manage and maneuver her way through the court to get what she wants without being ousted, or like Mordechai, without being pushed outside the gates and outside the limits, for wanting something that is so countercultural, which is so against everything that the current Persian empire stands for.
So, as you said before, the other big theme is anti-Semitism, and that, of course, sadly is a relevant theme in our Jewish lives in 2024. Before connecting it explicitly to modernity, just thinking of the story at face value, there's an interesting, tension, and you had already mentioned before that exile is sort of ubiquitous theme throughout the book. Again, it's unclear exactly if this is after the Jews were already allowed by Cyrus to go back to Jerusalem. We know famously, not just from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but also just from historic records, most of the Jews didn't want to go back to Jerusalem once they were allowed to. And so most Jews preferred exile, right? I oftentimes think of this in my head. A lot of people are shocked. And whenever I teach Jewish history and I talk about the lachrymosity after the first temple was destroyed, and we read Lamentations and we read, from Yirmiyahu, and then I say, 70 years later, the Jews were allowed to go back, and very few people did. Students are always shocked. And then I say, you guys do realize, as American Jews, every year we say next year in Jerusalem about 100 times throughout the year, and we're all still in America. And they're like, oh yeah, I guess that kind of does make sense. And so, right, just as an interesting parallel, but the Jews that are still in Shushan, presumably they are Jews that have made some attempt to want to stay in exile, right, assuming we're going with this interpretation. And it seems that at least one of the major themes connected to this idea of hiding is assimilation. And as you said before, it's unclear whether or not Mordechai and Esther were public Jews. Esther, once she becomes queen, is coached to hide her identity. Many of the Jews are presumably coming to this big Achashverosh party, and so a lot of them are trying to fit in. And one of the major themes, at least how I interpret it, and hopefully I'm not reading too much of my own contemporary bias into it, but you can check me if I am. The major theme and major lesson is you can think that attempting to assimilate in exile will curb anti-Semitism, but it's a foolish thing to try to do, because anti-Semitism will come to get you regardless of whether or not you are the public Jew sitting there, with the Star of David or with a kippah, or it will come to you whether you're hiding, right? The anti-Semites, right, do not discriminate based on types of Jews. And it seems like that's sort of the crux of the story, is things don't actually start getting better until the sort of masks come off. I'm curious if that coincides with your reading, and then we can drill more about the themes of anti-Semitism.
So I'm struck by what you said there at the end, that things don't get better until the masks come off, because I mean, at least from what I can see, is that Esther is the only one who actually pulls that off. Meaning, once the masks come off, when the mask comes off for Mordechai, when somebody outs him as a Jew to Haman, that's when the trouble begins, right? The whole notion or concept of passing and the threat to a Jewish population that can't pass in a hostile environment, that's very real. And it's real in the Book of Esther, and I don't think that theme has lost its relevancy even today. But in terms of Esther, she has to hide her identity until the critical moment where she places all her bets, all her chips on the table, and says, well, if I don't do this, what am I doing here? And she has to point to the Haman in the room and say, it's this guy, this evil Haman who wants to kill my people, without even, by the way, having to mention who her people are. In the same way that Achashverosh, when he signs off on the edict, seemingly doesn't even know which people he is agreeing to annihilate. Haman just comes to him with this nebulous, well, there are these people who are scattered all over, and their laws are different, and their customs are different, and it doesn't please the king to put up with them, to
Which is
tolerate.
also, sorry to cut you off, which is also paradoxical because he's describing Jews as spread out, right? He's not saying there are full Jewish enclaves in Brooklyn, right? Or in, Hamadan or in Susa or, wherever, he's not saying, this entire village, right, is trouble. The Jews are spread out, right? They're assimilated. Oh, and also they're bad because they're totally different, right? And that paradox of anti-Semitism is, are the Jews a problem because we're separate, or are the Jews a problem because we're, too much assimilated, right? Are we too universalist? Are we too particularist, right? So
Right.
just wanted to
I
highlight.
mean, yeah, no, absolutely. I think for me, it brings me back to Jean-Paul Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew, that classical work of philosophy about the Jew himself, where he says if the Jew didn't exist, right, that the anti-Semite would invent him, essentially, which is to say there's nothing inherent to the Jewish identity which is worthy of oppression in the same way that any human being, for whatever identity they possess, so long as it is not an identity that actively pursues to take over, to take from the rights and liberties of others, right, sort of in that sense. But as an identity, there's nothing in the Jewish peoplehood that justifies the anti-Semitism itself, right? It's sort of this reflection of the inability to have the total prostration and worship and the conformity of Mordechai to Haman that becomes the reason to get rid of all the Jews. Like, if this Mordechai wouldn't bow to me, then that means that all the Jews won't bow to me. He represents this Jewish people who are a thorn because they refuse to act in accordance with my will, to bend to me. And so there's this othering of them, and that othering becomes a need to destroy the other so as to maintain hegemony, so as to maintain a total sense of godlike self, right? The ego plays a big part in this, but there's nothing inherent, obviously, to the Jew in the same way that there isn't anything inherent to any other nationality or race or anyone in the world that is not deserving of, obviously, respect and rights. And so it turns that whole question on its head, in the sense that anti-Semitism is everywhere, and there was no escaping it then. There's no escaping it now. But by unmasking yourself, you're actually asking for it. And Esther somehow manages to time that unmasking in her position of power for it to spell the salvation of the Jews. And actually, the way that the Megillah is written itself, it's almost fantasy-like in its way that it compels the Jewish people to celebrate that this could ever be a thing, that this could ever happen, right?
You're talking about the end of the, post.
Yeah, the end, of course, the end where Esther goes ahead and points to Haman, and he is, after prostrating himself over her, which becomes this moment that is taken for a sexual encounter that Achashverosh happens in on, then everything completely reverses. Mordechai being hanged on the gallows of Haman. There's something very cathartic, right, about the ending of the Book of Esther as well. And I think in light of everything that's been happening, especially in the last several months here in Israel and around the world, at least and I know others are reading the Book of Esther with different eyes, perhaps, than we have before. So there is a relevancy to it that is absolutely timeless. But I don't know that the anti-Semitism piece, whether it's more or less exacerbated with the unmasking, but it's an unfortunate reality that when anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, actually Jews go into hiding usually, right?
Well, to drill down on that, and maybe I totally agree with you. So maybe to restate it a little bit, Achashverosh, as a character in the story, has always seemed to me a very neutral character. Obviously, there's readings of Achashverosh that make him out to be evil. There's readings that make him out to be, a doofus, right? In my mind, he's neutral. He's almost a blank slate, right? He's sort of just taking, right? If Haman says something, okay, great. If Mordechai says something, okay, great. You can't undo what you did before. Okay, great. We'll just do both of them, right? Like he's the epitome of, the wishy-washy politician, if we're gonna, get modern interpretation. And so a big theme is, we can't rely on the Achashverosh's of the world to watch out for the Jewish best interest, because Achashverosh has his finger to the wind, and if the people want the Jews to all be killed, okay, great. If the people want, Jews to be saved, okay, great, right? Like, and so it's not until, right, and it's a big lesson about, Jews in the diaspora / exile, and even on the flip side, this story, in my mind at least, and in the rabbinic interpretation also, is a great proto-Zionistic story as well. Almost saying, you really want to, save yourself, you actually need to enter into the political process, and you need to make your voice stand, and you need to basically, right, and that's more what I mean with the unmasking, that, I could imagine as a part of the story. I mean, I always, have a wild imagination when I'm reading Esther. I'm imagining there also being a lot of petitions going around the Jewish community in Shushan. If we collect 5,000 signatures, we can tell Achashverosh the decree to kill all the Jews is anti-Semitic, right? And in a sense, right, maybe that's important, maybe that's not, but it's not until somebody actually takes charge and takes a stand, like Esther, right. And the precariousness of it all is also stunning. And this is perhaps, at least in the rabbinic reading, I don't want to fuse, interpret the original book with the rabbinic lens, but the rabbis essentially say that when you live in exile, you're basically giving up on God's providence over you, and you're, opening it up to the outside influence. And we have this theme in Tanakh, right? We have the book of Daniel, right? Similar theme. We have Joseph, in Pharaoh's court, right? Similar theme. And so Esther is just almost like a long line of there. You had mentioned the idea of, the famous quote that if, Jews didn't exist, anti-Semites would have to invent them. It strikes me, and, you'll appreciate this as a scholar of English literature. What's always been striking to me is when you read old English literature, and, I will fully admit, in high school, I totally just spark noted all of these. So I never actually read the Canterbury Tales, but I read many spark note summaries of the Canterbury Tales. But in the last couple of years, I've gone back and read excerpts of things like the Canterbury Tales and, Shakespeare, and, which I, of course, also spark noted. I apologize if any of my high school English teachers are listening to this. I would never do it now, nor would I ever encourage my students to do it. But what's interesting in those books, and we know this from Jewish history in general, Jews were expelled from England sometime in the late 13th century. And so there were basically no Jews in England for about 500 or 600 years. And all of these books, right, Canterbury Tales, Shakespeare, a lot of these books are full of anti-Semitism, even though we can almost guarantee nobody who knew the people who were writing would have ever actually met a Jew. So this was all just this vague idea, or the same way we talk about aliens and we have a picture in our head, right? We are certain that if you see a green, a green figure with, perky ears, and they show up in a spaceship, right? We know those are aliens. How do we know? No idea, right? Someone probably 50 years ago decided to draw an alien like that, and that caught on. And, so that's almost how they saw Jews. And it's just so fascinating in terms of that lens. Just wanted to, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think it's very true what you're saying. And we see, like, in the letters between George Eliot, who was born Mary Ann Evans, but who went by the pen name George Eliot. She writes, after she published Daniel Deronda, which is her last novel and her seminal work on the Jewish community of Britain, in 1875, she published it. So she actually is very frustrated by the pushback she gets from the English society at large. There were a lot of haters, for lack of a better word. They couldn't understand what the Jewish plotline had to do with the Gwendolen plotline. And she writes to her good friend, Harriet Beecher Stowe, that she's so frustrated by the ignorance of the wider Anglican and Christian community that they have this preconceived notion of Jews, and they make these petty jokes about bacon and or pig and all of that. And they hardly understand that we come from this shared Judeo-Christian background, and that the very prophets that they study as part and parcel of their cultural digestion, right? The Bible having been the most important book to the Victorians, that that there is a greatness to the Jewish people that should be celebrated, and that there are similarities to Christians and Jews that should be celebrated for their commonalities, as opposed to the kind of anti-Semitism that she sees as rampant. And I think that was part of her purpose in writing Daniel Deronda. And of course, there in Daniel Deronda, you have the character of Mordechai. Mordechai is this consumptive prophet who sort of is looking for that person who is going to take a proto-Zionist sort of ethos forward and start considering, or actually go ahead and journey back to then Palestine, right, the land of Israel. And he finds this Daniel Deronda, who in one of my articles, I argue that he's an Esther figure for that, as well as being influenced by the book of Daniel. But yes, there is this sense of complete disconnect that she picks up on between those who critique Jews or are anti-Semites and people who actually know Jews, understand the community, and engage with it. And I think that that's also by itself a universal, theme or idea for us to take moving forward. And I think there's a lot of bravery in both the Book of Esther itself and in its receptive texts and novels, and that's a huge theme as well. The courage to go ahead in the face of danger, in the face of oppression, really, and vulnerability on a lethal level, to go ahead and to say this is something worth standing up for and fighting for. And I think Esther embodies that, and I think the Victorians and others throughout time have been incredibly impressed by that, and recently by Vashti too, for that matter. And sort of bringing it back, I guess, from the anti-Semitism piece to back a little bit to the feminist piece. During the Me Too movement recently, like, starting in 2016, 17, a lot of articles coming out about Vashti, around Purim time especially, started to see her in a completely new light because of the movement itself. And I think that speaks also to how there are waves to the interpretation of the text, and we're writing, I think, a very interesting one. And yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that as well.
Well, we've been talking for about 45 minutes, so I wanted to start heading towards a closing here. I wanted to open it up to see if there were any other aspects of the story, anything else that you thought important to highlight, sort of open floor.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so many intricacies to Megillat Esther. I think there's a chiastic structure to the text that we didn't even touch on. There's so many reversals, right? And there's so many important and interesting things that start out looking one way and end a totally different way. And it becomes this book of hope for the Jewish people, I think, especially Jews in exile. And I was struck by what you said in terms of it being itself an almost proto-Zionist text, in that it's not easy to maintain one's Jewish identity in exile for very long, meaning there will be highs and there will be lows, but I don't know if we can necessarily read the ending of the Book of Esther as entirely celebratory. There's something very tragic about it. Esther is still stuck in a loveless marriage, chained to a despot. Achashverosh, who, I should probably touch on that. You asked me about him. Is he a Parv character? Is he sort of like this,
Yeah, Achashverosh.
Right,
We
Achashverosh.
had said before, or I'll say before. I mean, it's fascinating just the number of comparisons to Donald Trump. Achashverosh, right? Again, is he sort of the is he the mastermind that has completely knows what he's doing and everything is very well calculated, or is it just we have no idea what this person stands for? Are there any values?
Yeah.
So that's my comment, not yours. But
Right. I mean, for me, that comparison was striking because in my own readings of Achashverosh, he is very honor-centric and egocentric. Everything is about displaying his wealth and his honor and being honored. So for a woman who was meant to be his sexual object to then go ahead and humiliate him so publicly, when all he really seeks is, I mean, just honor to the max, right? There's it's his main goal. It makes, it sort of strikes a chord. But yeah, he's also a character who I read, and I think others as well, Michael V. Fox also reads, as somewhat spineless and having no clue how to actually run a government. And so he's looking for anyone else to take the reins, take the lead. So he goes from having 7 advisors at the beginning to even that's just too complicated for him. He whittles that down to 1, just Haman, and whatever Haman says goes. He doesn't even know what people he wants to go ahead and wipe out. He's gonna say yes, right? And once that comes back to him through Esther, but Esther, her plea to Ahasuerus actually appeals to his honor and says, right, if it was just me, if it was just us, if we were only enslaved, I wouldn't say anything, but because me and my people are meant to be wiped out. Me, your wife, right? This is a direct affront to your honor. She couches it all in the language of honor. It becomes this cognitive dissonance moment for him where his right-hand man is apparently trying to kill his wife and her people. And that's been his modus operandi through the entire thing. And so Esther recognizes that and plays upon it. And then that comes full circle by the end when she's the one who's, her and Mordecai are sort of running the show and have the honor. But again, I still read it as sort of a tragic ending. They're still in exile. There's still always that potential for the next generation and the one after it not to have that protection, and for anti-Semitism to rear its ugly head yet again.
Yeah, and the rabbis are really critical. I mean, this is always such a stunning statement in the Talmud, but the rabbis comment on the last verse of the Book of Esther. And the last verse, there's an interesting interplay with the Hebrew. It says that Mordecai was liked by his brethren, but the word used is rove, right, which can be translated to many, right, as basically saying all or the majority. And so the rabbis have this really interesting interpretation in the Talmud where they say, why was Mordecai only liked by the majority of Jews, right? Why didn't all the Jews like him? And they said, well, there were people that criticized him because he wasn't spending time on the Sanhedrin, right? He basically was too busy in the political arena. And, this is sort of my commentary added to it, but the I think underlying critique is he wasn't back in Israel, meaning, exactly what you're saying, like seemingly happily ever after, but then, the Joseph story also seemed happy, right? If you read, just the book of Genesis, Joseph rises up to viceroy, seems like everything's perfect, right? He has enough food. He's able to take care of now his 70, family members. And then, of course, the next book of the Tanakh, Exodus, opens up, a new king arose, and that king, didn't know Joseph. And so, all of a sudden, start the theme of anti-Semitism again. So maybe in the, if there was another book after Esther, they can start off with, the next king arises and that king, forgot to read the Book of Esther and all of a sudden it happens. So yeah, I love what you're saying of the ending not necessarily being so happy.
Right. And then I think there are also throughout history, there are points of perception that picked up on this. So I'm thinking of one particularly from the 17th century, an Iranian Jewish author, and his name was Babai bin Lotf, and he wrote what was called the Kitab Anusim, the Book of the Forced Converts. And he lived through the Safavid dynasty, through the reigns of the Shah Abbas the first and second, and he witnessed firsthand the persecution of, I think he names like 19 different cities there, Iranian cities, where Jews were heavily, heavily persecuted. And yet, from the outset of the book, which is written in Judeo-Persian, and it's actually like the first historical record of the Jewish people, I think, that we have, he, like, a historical record as opposed to Tanachian record, he writes there that it's written in the structure of Megillat Esther quite purposefully. He's open about that. And you wonder why, because he's talking about massacres. Jews are forced to wear identifying insignia, which reminds us of something, I'm sure you know. And then they're, in a way, reminiscent to October 7th, how he describes it, right? They're burned, they're forced to convert to Shiism, which is, where the name comes from, Kitab Anusim. And so why would he draw from Esther for this? I think on some level, it's because the threat of the anti-Semitism is realized in his lifetime. Maybe in the Book of Esther, it's narrowly scraped by and avoided. But there's still even the imagination, the possibility of what happens afterwards. And it's almost as if he sees their community as the continuation of the story in a less favorable time. Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack when it comes to Esther. You can arrive at it from so many angles, from whether it's a national historical or at least cultural in that sense, or whether it's literary or religious, or for us as a Jewish community, as the basis for a holiday that we're about to celebrate. There's just so much, it's so rich, and I think there's no end really to the depth of the depths you can plumb when it comes to its reception, but its themes are everlasting, that's for sure.
Well, Dr. Channah Damatov, thank you so much for coming and discussing all these timely topics, and congrats again on having finished your dissertation just a couple of months ago.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. Thank you to all your listeners. And J Life with Daniel should go from strength to strength. And I'm wishing you all a happy Purim, and may we see better times.
Amen. Happy Purim.